Hello, and welcome to Grasping Reason, a channel about the big ideas of history, philosophy, and art. This time, in the series on Presocratic Philosophers, we'll be looking at Heraclitus, the sage of Ephesus. Heraclitus is associated with the Ionian settlement Ephesus on the western coast of the Anatolian Peninsula in modern-day Turkey. Ephesus was subject to some great turbulence during the 6th century BCE, being conquered first by the Lydians and then, following a war between Lydia and the Persians of the day, becoming a part of the Achaemenid Empire. At the time of Heraclitus, Ephesus would still have been a part of that Persian Empire. The ancient biographer Diogenes Laertius tells us that Heraclitus was active in the 69th Olympiad, which places him at roughly 500 BCE. When we talk about the surviving work of Heraclitus, as with many of the pre-Socratics, we are actually referring to the extant fragments of his work that appeared as quotations and references in other ancient writers. In the case of Heraclitus, these fragments number over 100, and they have been collected together on a website dedicated to them, maintained by Randy Hoyt. That may be the large part of Heraclitus's actual works, or frankly, it may not. We have no primary source for Heraclitus's work, like with the other pre-Socratics. The extant fragments are collected out of quotations from other ancient authors, who we might believe had access to a primary source themselves. We are hoping that these other writers accurately reflect his works, but that should not be assumed. With that in mind, today we'll look at three themes present in Heraclitus's fragments: the unity of opposites, constant flux or change, and fire as a fundamental element. The way up and the way down is one and the same. The first constant theme in Heraclitus's work is what we will call the unity of opposites. In very basic terms, this means that ostensibly opposite or conflicting concepts are actually, for Heraclitus, parts of a unified whole. In the fragment I led this section with, we see a useful example of this. The path on a hill when viewed from the bottom is the path up the hill. When viewed from the top, it is the path down the hill. It is the exact same path, but it presents two concepts given the reference point of the person describing it. For Kirk, Raven and Schofield, in the second edition of the Presocratic Philosophers, this is one of four different ways that Heraclitus indicates this unity of opposites. This is further divided by them into two categories, the first of which is, and I quote, opposites which inhere in, or are simultaneously produced by, a single subject. This includes opposite descriptions depending on reference point, as described in the example I just gave, as well as opposing effects from the same source on different subjects, like seawater being good for a fish but toxic to a human. And lastly, for this first categorization, a positive state can sometimes only be understood in terms of the negative state that it opposes, or in the style of Heraclitus, it is sickness that makes health pleasant and good. The second categorization, including only the fourth of Heraclitus's ways of expressing this unity of opposites, is those opposites that are single parts of the same process. In fragment 88, Heraclitus says, "And it is the same thing in us that is quick and dead, awake and asleep, young and old. The former are shifted and become the latter, and the latter in turn are shifted and become the former." For Heraclitus, existence is formed of these instances of unity of opposites, and while we can view these minute unities in isolation, they are also constituent parts of a wider unity, representing, well, everything. Heraclitus believed ultimately that all things should be considered as a single thing. So as we look at things in isolation, we may recognise their conflicting position within an individual opposite, but we should also attempt to understand their position within the whole, and the importance of balance within that whole, which we should remember when we move into discussion of eternal flux shortly. We can see an attempt to express these ideas with fragment 10, in which he states, "Things whole and not whole, what is drawn together and what is drawn asunder, the harmonious and the discordant. The one is made up of all things, and all things issue from the one. And fragment 51. They do not apprehend how being at variance it agrees with itself. There is a back-stretched connection, as in the bow and the lyre. The first part of that last quoted fragment also underscores an important point to be made about the unity of opposites, in that the existence of the oppositional tension is often not apparent to a normal view of the world. If we see change in a thing, we may notice change in its opposition. But for Heraclitus, that change must be reflected in each pair, in order to retain the unity of all things. Speaking of change. On those who enter the same rivers, ever different waters flow. Perhaps the most well-known tenet of Heraclitus' philosophy is this concept of an eternal flux, that all the world and its constituent parts are undergoing a constant process of change. The fame of this tenet is somewhat thanks to the reception of Heraclitus by other thinkers, which is something we'll address later, but we should also note the effective imagery of this particular fragment. While we can name a river, and see it as a somewhat singular entity, the Yellow River, the Mississippi, the Thames, etc., the concept of a river speaks of the constant flow of new waters passing through it. In the time it takes to point at a river and say its name, the waters you first pointed at are long gone downstream, and they will never return to the exact formulation of constituent parts that you were pointing at. The river, then, illustrates most perfectly the crux of Heraclitean philosophy, that it is constant change that defines the whole, that in reference to a fixed and ostensibly unchanging unity of all things, we disguise the constant movement of all the parts which it contains. Kirk, Raven and Schofield suggest a reformulation of this fragment into language a modern philosopher may use as the unity of the river as a whole is dependent upon the regularity of the flux of its constituent waters. Another common theme with Heraclitus is that of strife. Strife is the interaction between opposites, the push and pull of conflicting things. As the source pushes water into the stream, the estuary pulls the water out from the river. When the roiling movement of a wave crashes into a cliff face, it meets the apparent steadfast fixity of rock. With the benefit of millennia of scientific investigation, we know that both elements are modified by this interaction, a transfer of minerals as an example. But this alone wouldn't change the message that Heraclitus conveys. In fact, it strengthens this tenet. Strife between opposites expresses the eternal flux of things taken in isolation. But despite all that, the stability of everything taken as one persists. The coastline is always where sea and land meet, even after some rocks are washed off a cliff. This world, which is the same for all, no one of gods or men has made, but it always was, is and will be, an ever-living fire, with measures of it kindling and measures going out. In this quote, Heraclitus elevates an ever-living fire to a position of primacy and makes the assertion that it is undergoing a constant stabilizing transfer of both kindling and going out. That sounds a lot like the understanding of the unity of the whole that I attempted to unpack a little earlier. I think that's a fair equation, and we can certainly see this ever-living fire as a way of expressing the unity, and more specifically, the mechanism of change in that unity. Or at least, a loose approximation of what may be a heavily metaphorized expression of how the world works. Given that our knowledge of Heraclitus comes from the quotation of fragments in the works of other writers, we cannot say for sure how much is a metaphor in Heraclitus' own mind. I find myself leaning on a metaphorical interpretation, however, and especially when it comes to the discussion of fire. Other elements exist for Heraclitus, But it is through transformation from fire, balanced by an equal transformation back into fire, that we get these elements. The other elements, as stated by Heraclitus, are sea and earth. Fire is clearly in a position of primacy, given the way that Heraclitus talks of it, such as in fragment 90. All things are an interchange for fire, and fire for all things. But it seems there is a sort of ordering of each of the elements, as he states in another fragment that sea, which comes from fire, then generates earth. The transformations of fire, first sea, and of the sea half is earth, half whirlwind. Sea pours out, and is measured by the same amount as before it became earth. This is not a cyclical arrangement, however. The sea is generated from fire, and also nourishes fire, without requiring transformation first into earth. Throughout these statements, however, we see that there is always an effort to express balance, or measure, in these transformations. The stability of the whole is never jeopardized because any transformation is balanced against its opposite transformation, perhaps somewhere else. As it is better stated in Kirk, and Schofield, the logos, or proportion, remains the same. Again, it is the measure and regularity of change, this time of large-scale cosmological change, that is stressed. Just as on the cosmological scale, fire is also the composition of the human soul. While it is stated of the soul that it comes into being from moisture, moisture should be seen as the nourishing aspect of water into fire, and a soul can be eradicated through its drenching by water, by becoming too moist. Perhaps my favourite of the fragments talks of the diminishment of the soul by excessive drinking. A man, when he gets drunk, is led by a beardless lad, tripping, knowing not where he steps, having his soul moist. Before I move on to the reception of Heraclitus' ideas, I want to take a moment to touch on a common theme in the fragments. He seems to dislike other people, or at least hold them in low regard. Diogenes Laertius goes as far as calling Heraclitus a misanthrope, and many of the fragments give the impression that this is true. Now, it isn't for you or I to judge a 2,500-year-old man on this, but it gives some insight into the way the fragments are presented. Many of them are entirely prescriptive, telling people how they should approach the search for wisdom or knowledge, and others discuss how unlikely it is that the common person can grasp the knowledge that he imparts. Again, Diogenes Laertius suggests that Heraclitus is writing in a way that could shroud his meaning from ordinary people, and while the analysis of other writers can never truly reveal the intentions of Heraclitus himself, we should perhaps take to heart the possibility that he did not really want to be understood. With that in mind, let's take a look at how he was received by other prominent thinkers throughout our history. Socrates says, Heraclitus is supposed to say that all things are in motion and nothing at rest. He compares them to the stream of a river and says that you cannot go into the same water twice. Hermogenes says, that is true. This quote comes from one of Plato's Socratic dialogues, this one named after a man we believe to have been active between 50 to 100 years after Heraclitus' active years. Socrates, as usual, stands in for Plato as the most correct opinion within a dialogue between Hermogenes and Cratylus, who are ostensibly discussing language and the correctness of terms. Cratylus is known to us as a proponent of Heraclitean philosophy, partly in thanks to this dialogue, but also thanks to Aristotle's brief discussion of him in his Metaphysics. But it is appropriate that the main tenet of Heraclitean philosophy is stated by Socrates, and it is Hermogenes and not Cratylus that affirms the position. Maybe Cratylus would be inclined to say, that is not true, instead. Sure, the maxim of the changing nature of the waters of the river was stated by Heraclitus, and we addressed that earlier in this video. But what is missing in Plato's characterization is what I hope to have shown was a key component from that fragment. The waters of the river are always changing, but the river is a stable entity in which that change occurs. To understand Heraclitus, we cannot ignore that despite an emphasis on change, there is a stability of the whole, there is a balance with all transformations, there is an everlasting fire. Change without this suggests that the world as Heraclitus knows it would someday be completely altered, and that assertion is not found in Heraclitus' fragments. Kirk, Raven and Schofield stated that Aristotle accepted the Platonic flux interpretation and carried it still further, and with the two most influential ancient thinkers on the same page with regards to Heraclitus' legacy, the understanding of Heraclitus throughout our history has been framed somewhat erroneously. Throughout the history of Heraclitean interpretation, Nietzsche stands out as notable, as he refers to Heraclitus in glowing terms in his Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, and in Ecce Homo refers to Heraclitus in fraternal terms, in whose presence alone I felt warmer and more at ease than anywhere else. We can certainly imagine that the aphoristic style that Nietzsche is well known for owes a debt to the style of Heraclitus' fragments, but it's hard to equate the wide-reaching prolific musings of Nietzsche with the limited scope of the few fragments we have from Heraclitus. Heraclitus is still being studied to this day by many an ancient philosopher, and it is a testament to his ideas that so many students find something to resonate with in his surviving works. While we can see his work through the eyes of many philosophers since him, especially so given the existence of his works as merely quotations by other philosophers, it is important that we recognise that much of these treatments of him are somewhat misrepresentative of his ideas. We should, then, try to understand as much of Heraclitus as we can from the fragments themselves, rather than by their interpretation by others. If you enjoyed this video, then please press like and subscribe to the channel, and let me know what your favourite Heraclitean fragment is in the comments below. Goodbye.